Okay, welcome to the Bartlett International Lecture Series. This evening I'm introducing Addy. You might know has studied at Bartlett quite a few years ago, and which gives, I think, to this lecture a particular relevance. And since now some of the students of the unit just came into the lecture, we can sort of start. What I want just to say is that Ben was somebody who I met for the first time in the year 2000 when I organized an exhibition of Bartlett work, which went to Portugal and to Germany, to Munich. And I think we were 6 people exhibiting. And I sort of chose 2 or 3 people from the master's course, at the time called the Architectural Design course, and also chose some from the Diploma, which is now the Architecture. And Ben was one of them. We didn't know each other at all, but I remember going through the summer show, and there were these big renderings. We're talking about 2000. These huge renderings, incredibly well rendered, first of all, spatially absolutely mesmerizing. And completely out of context. In fact, I mean, I was sort of a young tutor at the time and was proud of running a digital unit at that time. And our competitors were at the time Unit 18. And there is this guy in Unit 21, which was led by Christine Hawley and C.J. Minn, doing these renderings, which led all the other tutors, the other students, puzzled and envy what he was producing at the end of the show. They were just fantastic. And in fact, that work then was put together as part of this exhibition, which was hugely successful. We call the exhibition Flesh and Vision, because in fact the work was very disparate at the time. And it was really quite astonishing how these different pieces of work show the diversity of work that Bartlett was producing already in that period. Since then, we sort of kept closely in contact, and I knew that Ben was working for Wilkins Air for a short period of time, and then in 2004 he established the office Moxon. He just told me that there's no particular meaning to it. It's actually one of his names. I always wondered whether there was a sort of special symbolic meaning. In the meantime, with Tim Murray, they both joined run this office. And then I became director, and I've been chairing the BSc reviews, and Ben has been running a unit in the BSc, although in different partnerships. So we have sort of met. And then more recently, I was invited as a jury member for a competition in Taiwan for the Taiwan Tower in Taichung. And amongst hundreds of submissions, it sort of gradually becomes narrower and narrower in terms of the selection. And there is Ben Eddy's work, Moxon's work with Tim Murray, amongst these projects. And it went down to the last 8, and there was Moxon amongst these 8. And I kept quite quiet because the other jury members, sort of one or 2 of them started spotting that in their CV they were Bartlett related. And at some point in the meeting with the sort of final round, they said, do you know these people from Moxon? Have you heard of them? And I obviously said, of course I know them, because they are teachers at Bartlett, one of them, and they have been students at Bartlett. And so that sort of immediately meant for the others, right, so there's a relationship. In fact, I wasn't the only one. There were some other people that were teachers or students from some people that submitted the work. But the fact that out of these hundreds of applications there was this project by a company that was established by an ex-Bartlett student was a beautiful moment for me, because it meant that in fact the work that we do is not only a beginning and an end in terms of our academic career that the student goes through. In fact, there is something that comes after, which is probably more meaningful than necessarily what we do here. And clearly Ben is a sort of somebody with Tim who had the sort of strength to say, my studies finished, they finished very well. We had all the sort of commendations and distinctions and all the awards necessary when we finished. But the life after the Bartlett is where it becomes really tough, where it means to face the world out there and keep running with an office, which I remember once we went to the Bartlett Summer Show and I asked him how it was going. He said, it's pretty hard at this stage, and this was 3 years ago, where there was a real deep moment of the office, and in fact a lot of offices in London were hardly surviving. But this enormous strength and effort and relentless sort of energy put into an office that has to survive and becomes actually very successful and then ends up in competitions and winning competitions being in the end game. In fact, I remember now, there was another competition which I also was a jury member, where you also were, which was this sort of Portuguese-English relationship of the Architecture Foundation. Again, Moxon was there, and it was present as part of the last final competition entries that we were selecting. Now, what I'm saying here is basically that Ben is rooted in the system here, but being part of RIBA at certain times has won several awards. The work that they both do is in the Royal Academy Summer Show almost every year. And in fact, London is on the one hand an extraordinary resource, but it's a very tough platform to work with and work in. In particular because there's this very particular scenario of huge offices which are incredibly well structured and powerful and resourceful, which suck into the offices almost all the talent that comes from the schools. And we as a Bartlett face this as a phenomenon. It gives all the students jobs, but it creates a downside, which is that an office like Thames and Hudson has to survive in competing with these large offices, these large enterprises, which partly are amazing actually. Why? Because like you when you were at Wilkinson Air, were designing sort of bridges and these incredibly elegant pieces, and they are great. So in a sense, I remember that Barry is sitting there, we had lunch the other day, and Barry was questioning of what's the strategy to after the studies and after doing the 5th year, what's the way forward? And I couldn't really give advice. I mean, I just said, look, this is a tough game. And I think exactly for that reason, Ben's lecture is seriously relevant because it touches exactly that point, which you all at some point either are in or are going to be in, which is what do you do next, and how do you take what you have gained from the Bartlett as students, and how do you take that further into an architectural practice as a contribution in a way to the architectural scene, to the society. So I heard also that Ben is going to talk about this, that rather than sort of showing off some of actually some exquisite work that they're doing, it's more to do with exactly these strategies and these principles of keeping an office becoming a successful office. And I remember in conversation with Neil McLaughlin, him saying that it took him 10 years to establish his office. Until he got to the 10-year level, the office was really not established. It was a sort of touch-and-go system of it might survive, it might not survive. Sometimes you have enormous amounts of work, sometimes you don't have any. Sometimes it's hugely successful, sometimes it's completely in jeopardy of what you're doing. And I heard that your office is now 9 years old, so you're sort of gradually getting there. 8.5, so you have another year and a half to say, now it's an established office, which it is already. And in fact, I know that Ben partly moved to Scotland while the office is still running here, because there's a sort of strategy of having a feet in 2 different places simultaneously in order also to get more clients and do, hopefully, always the work that one wants to do, and not to be forced only to do certain work that keeps you sort of alive. Anyway, in summary, I think this trajectory for me is, I think, fascinating and really interesting. And clearly, there are quite a few people from the Bartlett in recent years, like Softgroom, Lynn Fox. We have the older generation of Paul Alford and Simon Monaghan, who are obviously incredibly established practice nowadays. People who studied here managed to get through this first period of their career and then survived it, and then they were absolutely up there. And you don't know, but something like 10 years ago, there was a lecture given by Mark Wigley. And this lecture was about the young architect. And it was one of the most hilarious, but also one of the most depressing lectures I have seen. The whole room was laughing and partly sort of in a mood of crying as well, because it was about the reality of all these young architects coming out of academia and having to establish something and having all the highest ambitions. But the reality is that only a few manage really to survive in all this and to become meaningful to others in a sense. And everybody left the sort of lecture thinking like, gosh, this was serious reality in a sort of jokey manner. We all laughed and it was all fine. But it was a wake-up call in a sense as well. And soon after, the Bartlett produced a book which was called Bartlett Works, which was edited by Ian Borden and some other senior members, which was exactly that. It was the attempt to look at where all the Bartlett students were going. What was really the influence of the Bartlett outside the school? What was it after the moment when students finished? And it was a risky game because we did not know what was going to be in this book. At some point, people were very nervous because they felt, we have the best students without any doubt, but do we have the most influential people out there? The book was, I think, successful because it demonstrated that the Bartlett, the ex-Bartlett students, the alumni, are basically everywhere and in very different manners, not only running their own offices, running big projects in big companies, being filmmakers, being in advertising, being anywhere, teachers, etc. So that was an interesting moment, and again it had to do with this topic of where is an ex-Bartlett student going and how is the career path being developed. I pass over my word to you. Thanks a lot for joining us tonight. Thank you very much. From the back there, just join us a bit more in the front. If you're very far away, you probably will have difficulties in listening. And there's absolutely no one for everybody to George.
Thank you very much, Marcus, for the introduction. It was extremely kind, but also extremely kind of thorough. I sort of don't need to present all that much now. I think you've sort of encapsulated a lot of what Tim and I do in that sort of 5 minutes sort of introduction. I think before coming here, I was sort of concerned about what sort of presentation to give you all, because obviously, as Marcus says, I did my part 2 and my part 3 here. As well as being a tutor here. I think I've been tutoring here now for 7 years or something. So it seems a bit sort of curious. Normally when I do these things, I sort of present a whole load of projects and just sort of run through each one and talk a bit about them, and then all the students sort of ask a question about the one that they like the look of, and then that's it. But to me, that sort of seems a little bit impersonal for you guys, because you're all, well, at least I recognize quite a few of the faces in the audience. I've either critted you or you're in fact my students or ex-students. So I wanted to kind of use this as an opportunity to sort of share thoughts that we don't normally get to talk about in tutorials, because in tutorials we're talking about your work, and I sort of thought I'd try and talk a bit about, obviously a bit about our work, but also talk about some stuff that I've kind of learned along the way, and I think Tim's learned along the way as well. You've probably seen this lecture poster that Michelle has put together. It's a really sort of lovely, elegant poster. You'll notice that compared to all the other posters that have gone up for the lecture series, there's no title and there's no information at all on it apart from my name and the date. This is the tower that Marcus was talking about, but you wouldn't know that from the poster because it doesn't tell you. And the simple reason is that I've not really done anything on this presentation until literally the last minute, sort of yesterday and then a bit this afternoon when I came down to London. There's no excuse because obviously I agreed to do the presentation last autumn, I think it was some point. But I've just been sort of terrified by the prospect of talking to you guys because, like I say, the tables have been turned. It's your chance to sort of poke at my projects. Normally I'm the one sort of sitting alongside Marcus or Laura or Reese or whatever with my hands behind my head, crossed feet, pointing at your work and telling you where you need to sort of pull your socks up, and now it's your opportunity to get your own back. So that's why there's nothing on that sheet. Last night, I sort of figured that actually what I wanted to talk about, if I'd done this sooner, this would have been the title on the poster that Michelle put together, it would be diversity. So that's what I'm going to try and hang my presentation around. It means that a lot of what you'll see, there's an awful lot of slides. I've got 590 slides in this presentation. Well, more on that in a second. I mean, I'm very happy for you to interject at any time, you know, just sort of make a noise or stick your hand up or something if you've got a question or something you want to point out, much like I do to you in crits. You should feel free to, you know, give a wisecrack or a smart comment or something. It's your turn. Diversity is really important in architecture. It's absolutely vital. It's something that I feel very passionately about. I'm sure Tim does too. Bartlett, the reason I love the Bartlett is and the reason I think it's a great school is because of its diversity. Marcus was talking about the exhibition that I was involved in with him 10 years ago, 12 years, 15 years ago, God, however long ago it was. And it was very diverse, and that was very true then, it's very true now. Diversity of your background as students is sort of remarkable. I think it gets more remarkable all the time, actually. The diversity of the pedagogic approach that the tutors have is incredible, and then there's obviously the enormous diversity of output at the end of the year. Likewise, architecture more generally, I think architecture's in really good health at the moment, even though, you know, we're all kind of skint and it's really tough economically, particularly as a young practice and particularly probably in this city, actually. I think it's very tough being an architect in London. The actual diversity of work that you see is remarkable. There's not one way of doing things that has the edge on anything else, and I think that's really positive. I'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. And to sort of talk about that in the context of our practice, this is probably the most boring slide of the whole international lecture series. I mean, it's fascinating for me, and it's fascinating for Tim, but it's really dry and boring for you guys. This represents the turnover of our practice since it was incorporated on the 24th of October 2004, which was the exact day that I got my Part 3. I'm sort of digressing here. The reason I'm saying that is because you can't call a limited company an architecture firm. You can't have the word architect or architects in it unless you've got your Part 3. So my mission that I set myself when I was at the Bartlett was to get my Part 3 as quickly as I possibly could and then incorporate and do my own thing. Things kind of worked out in a kind of a lucky way for me a little bit, in the sense that I won a couple of competitions which got me a bit of cash, which was enough to sort of start to buy some equipment. And then there was a competitive interview for the first project that the practice ever did around about that time. So all these things kind of fell together. So yeah, the timing was right, but it was also a lot easier to be an architect back in them old days, 2004, 2005. You can see, obviously, you've got different financial years. I told you this is a boring slide. Various colors represent different sectors of work. So the dark color in the top left-hand corner, that's commercial. And in that year, you can see we were doing all commercial work. That's because we only had one job. It was an office. And then you can see as the years progress, more colors kind of get added to it. This, I think, in the 2005, 2006, in the top kind of between 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock, that color is tutoring. That's the money that the practice earned by me coming to the Bartlett to tutor. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff coming in, private residential work starting to come in. That's the sort of, I'm colorblind, so I'm not very much used to identifying these colors, but there's kind of, is that sort of baby blue, is it, I think? I don't know, the sort of light color. That's residential work, so it's the sort of, the kind of standard fare for any kind of London architect is really doing house extensions, and that's what that is, at least until further down. And then it's all kind of, it's growing quite nicely. It was times were very easy for architects in the sort of mid 2000s, I'd say. And then you can see 2008, 2009, which is a fantastic year financially. This is when, I think, Tim, you joined at the tail end of 2007. I think that's right, it's 5 years. And that big pink wedge, that's Tim. That's Tim joining, which is a sort of a whole new strand of work for the practice. And then you can see there's other stuff going on. The one that I want to talk about, though, most particularly, is this sort of, the kind of orange color. I'll just sort of point to it. This color here, which you can see is present in almost all of the pie charts. That's the money that we've earned from open competitions. That's something that's very important to us. I think the pie charts as a whole demonstrate diversity. You can see that the diversity of the practice is growing all the time. So there's commercial, there's interiors work, there's bridge work, infrastructure work, all of which I'm going to show you examples of this evening. But the competition thing is really the thing to sort of focus on at the moment, because although it's a relatively small chunk of those pie charts, actually what we spend our time, well, not our time, because we spend our time doing everything, but what we like to think about as much as we can is the competitions, and then everything else kind of tucked in at the side there. This is a much more accurate kind of portrayal of what the company, I think, is about. Unfortunately, well, we do this because in order to get interesting work as a young architect, you need to enter competitions. We're sort of in a better position now. We are getting some quite interesting work through finishing other projects and being invited on to look at certain things and make some suggestions here and there, or perhaps be invited into some competitions, quite rarely actually. But generally speaking, all of the work that's taken us from being the practice that we once were to a different sort of practice has come through an open competition. I really want to stress that open competitions are the riskiest way of getting work, because you're spending your money and your time with absolutely no expectation of winning anything at the end of it. It's a kind of, as a business model, it's insane. But having said that, it's the only way that you can kind of get new and interesting work. And I thought I'd show you some. These are competition boards. It's actually not all of them. It's quite a lot of them. This is probably, I don't know, it represents probably about 75% of the competition boards that the practice has put together in the course of the last 9 years. I'll talk about a few of them, like without sort of this sort of epilepsy-inducing flashing in a minute, but it gives you an idea of the kind of diversity of stuff that we're chasing. All this work is financed by the other work that we do in the practice. We don't. You need to pay yourselves. You pay your rent. You pay all the normal overheads of an office. So effectively, you're taking a gamble each time you do one of these things, and they're quite time-consuming as well. I'll just let this sort of play out. It's kind of terrifying when you see it like this. The sort of sheer amount of work that's gone into all this stuff. It's really sobering. You'll be pleased to hear we're nearing 2013. Here we go. That's us. So that isn't all the competitions we've done. And in a sense, I could just stop the presentation there and say that I'm using all of these images to convey my point about diversity. Diversity isn't just important commercially, in the sense that if you're doing lots of different things, then hopefully some sectors will carry on even when other sectors are being kind of cut back on. So for example, public work, after 2007 crash, there was very little public work. There was virtually no commercial private work, although that's sort of starting to pick up a little bit more now. But by having your fingers in lots of different pies, you can hopefully sort of try and negotiate the difficulties of having, certain types of work falling away. Then you can rely on other sorts of work. So there's always a trick that you try and portray yourself as an expert in lots of different things. So to some people, I'll sort of show you this later on, but some people think that we are bridge architects because we've done bridges. Other people think we're interior architects because we do interiors. The people who think we're bridge architects don't really know that we do interiors, and vice versa. The interiors clients don't really know that we're bridge architects as well, or that we do private houses, or that we do product design as well. So you have to sort of put on a different face to different people. Anyway, entering competitions brings diversity to the practice. In one sense, because open competitions, the brief is obviously set by someone else, and there's only so many of them out there. There aren't that many genuinely open competitions. So you need to pre-qualify for things, which means you need to demonstrate that you've done that sort of work before. So if you're serious about doing the open competitions, you kind of have to take what's out there, which means that you end up doing a very diverse range of projects, and that's actually a very positive thing. It's also true that very few genuine open competitions actually have a prospect of an actual building at the end of it. They tend to be ideas competitions, particularly in the UK. But this is one open competition that we won back in 2005, 6. I think it was just my first year teaching at the Bartlett. We won this competition. Now, this was a two-stage competition. It was an open competition. I'm not particularly going to dwell on it because it's quite a long time ago now. But I'm going to use it to sort of set up a discussion about diversity in another way in terms of the practice. Incidentally, we obtained planning permission for this about the same time as Thomas Heatherwick released the images of his Shanghai pavilion to the press. So there was something probably in the air at the time. There was no kind of knowledge of either scheme. Obviously his has been built and this one's still on ice, which is a real shame. We'd have loved to have built it. Still in touch with the client though, so you never know. Every time I speak to him once a year and he's always sort of saying, oh well, as soon as the economy picks up, we'll build that building. We're still waiting some years later. Now it was, or it is, or it will be, a very expensive building. So as you might expect, there's a very heavyweight jury for the competition. And after the open stage, we were shortlisted along with 4 other practices, all of them older, all of them more established. What's really interesting is that 2 of them, one practice was from Holland, one practice was from Germany, and then 3 practices were Bartlett. C.J. Lim, who was my tutor in Diploma, and a guy called Stuart Piercy, who was the person that I was actually tutoring with at the time. It was completely kind of, I mean, obviously it wasn't coincidental in the sense that there was a jury that had selected it, and none of them were Bartlett. They were people like Ian Simpson and the guys from Urban Splash. They had no idea who we were. But nonetheless, there we were, the 3 sort of Bartlett connections, which is fascinating, from about 90 submissions to the competition. Now, part of our challenge at that point was convincing the jury that not only did we have the ideas that they'd be interested in, because they'd obviously selected us on the back of the ideas that were in this sort of scheme, but also that we had the competency, that we were able to actually do this thing. As you can imagine, most part of the discussion revolved around whether or not we could actually deliver what you call the detailed design, so the actual construction design for the Brise Soleil that you see in these images. And to be fair, to be frank, it's a very fair question. Around about the same time, we finished this private residential project up in Belsize Park in sort of Camden, North London. And this has a suspended screen which is completely disconnected from the facade. So the timber kind of slats that you see there are completely separate structurally to the rest of the facade, such that this screen kind of hovers over the glazing and the black rubber that's situated behind that timber. That image shows it relatively clearly. I think you can see the timber is offset quite a long way from the facade of the building. Very similar to what we were looking to achieve with Preston. In fact, it's actually exactly the same detail in a sort of construction sense. The only difference is that instead of having bits of structure or bits of timber that are running parallel to the facade, these are bits of aluminium that are sticking out perpendicular to the facade. Well, in some places perpendicular, in some places parallel. So by showing the jury that we'd done a very similar thing to this on a £140,000 house extension, we won a £14 million office building. And we beat the guy that I was tutoring with, which was rather nice, and then beat CJ, which was kind of strangely embarrassing, actually. Needless to say, if there was no open competition and the whole thing was run as a normal kind of pre-qualification, then we wouldn't have had a look in. So the point of the story is that clients, especially public sector clients, should be prepared to open up to young architects. And this is the sort of thing that young architects say all the time, and even the press occasionally kind of gets in on the story, but it doesn't change. You know, the only way for a young architect to get anywhere really is to enter these open competitions. Unfortunately, it's a long haul and it's tough, but that's kind of the way life is at the moment. Now, I was 27 when we won this particular competition. I'm not saying that to sort of try and sound, you know, clever or whatever. I'm saying it because you guys are all in your sort of early 20s, and you'll be coming out of here in your slightly less early 20s, and then you'll be getting your Part 3s around about the same time that I got my Part 3. And the point of saying this is that age is kind of irrelevant, because a lot of people think that age is a reliable indicator of experience, and I'd say that it isn't. And nor is it a reliable indicator of whether or not your ideas are any good. And chances are actually that your ideas are going to be a lot better than all the practices, including probably our own when you guys are qualifying, which is sort of slightly terrifying thought. You should all, you know, have the confidence to enter competitions yourself, you know, in your summer holidays now. I mean, why not? You know, you don't need to be an architect to register generally, so you should just go for it. And particularly when you do your own thing, or you're working for another practice, don't forget to, you know, enter your own competitions. You're very capable of beating more established practices. So showing those two projects kind of illustrates something about diversity. On the one hand, it's commercially sensible to, you know, do lots of things, but it's also creatively very powerful, because that little house extension, modest as it is, in a conservation area in Camden, very difficult place to build anything interesting, let alone, you know, sort of as sort of extravagant as Preston, or as extravagant as you'd like to make it. Nonetheless, the sort of things that you're dealing with in terms of construction detail actually help you with other projects. They help you creatively. So you should, you know, be very prepared to sort of widen your net and look at as many different things as you can, and try and get as much different work in as many different areas as you can, because actually one thing feeds off the other. You can't always predict where the ideas are going to come from. And in particular, you learn stuff in detailed design on site that can have a tremendous impact on your design process generally. We wouldn't have dreamt up that facade for Preston had we not done that little house extension with that particular detail. That's where the idea for Preston came from. It came from that small house extension for that lady up in North London. You know, it's an unusual kind of thing. It's not something you can predict. So doing real work is really important to us, and, you know, real work that is on site. I mean, Tim and I always say to each other that we always want to have something being built. You know, we don't want to be one of these practices where you are kind of, you know, it's all very well to be developing ideas, and we really want to be doing that. That's the reason why we're in practice. But we always want to be having something on site, because that's, you know, it reminds you what the point of being an architect, but it kind of gives you all sorts of ideas that you just wouldn't have otherwise. So it's actually a very fertile kind of ground for kind of new, interesting ways of doing things. So this, like I say, this is the first project that the practice completed. This is that dark dot on the pie chart slide that represented the entire turnover for the first year. It's a car designer's studio in Notting Hill. This is a detail of the staircase in the project. This project was designed for such sort of stupid tolerances. that the guy that built the staircase, and in fact did a lot of the things on the interior of the building, well, it had to be built by a guy who made classical guitars in his spare time. I mean, the level of precision that was on the drawings that that we did was sort of insane and unnecessary and kind of hilarious. But nonetheless, you know, at the time, it seemed like the most important thing in the world, and it was. So, you know, we specified incredibly and unbelievably demanding finishes. This sort of lacquer is extremely difficult to do. There's about 10 different coats of paint, all kind of sanded down. It's a very demanding finish. And I suppose we're a bit more tolerant these days, or a bit more realistic about how we go about doing things. This is an exploded drawing of the project. You can see it's a Georgian townhouse that has been effectively gutted. There's a couple of interesting things about it. There was a coal cellar underneath the ground floor, which you couldn't quite stand up in, so it was kind of useless. So we just took away the ground floor entirely. So as you're walking through the front door, you're coming in kind of on a mezzanine level, which is totally unexpected for a townhouse in Notting Hill. And then you have that sort of shiny white thing that you saw, which is the staircase. And then on the upper level, we exposed the butterfly roof, which is sort of valley roof, and put in a new kind of soffit to that. And then all of the services were contained within that soffit or within that tower that you can see on the right-hand side there. So we had cloakrooms and toilets and all the rest of it, which freed up the rest of the building to kind of be this sort of pristine, well, car designer studio. That's the soffit, that's the ceiling above the top flight of the stairs. Looks incredibly like an iPod. It's very sort of spooky. It was totally undeliberate. Like I say, the guy that we were doing this for was a car designer. And car designers work to really crazy tolerances. I think that's why I was trying to work to millimeter or less than millimeter precision, which normally on a building you're sort of working to precision of something about the size of your thumb. You know, not quite, it's, I don't know, a couple of millimeters here and there, doesn't really matter. But this guy, everything's so precise, and everything, his whole life is sort of like this, and he's kind of an exhausting person to be around because he needs everything to sort of be pinned down. So he's a very demanding client, and I love doing this project, but it was incredibly stressful. And I think for a first project, after getting my part 3, it had all the kind of killer part 3 questions in it. I don't know how many of you are Diploma. You seem to be mostly BSc here. Is that right? No interaction. Okay. Anyway, part 3, you get all these questions about what to do if the builder goes insolvent or if the building collapses into the road or whatever else. Anyway, this project had all of those kind of questions because the builder did go insolvent and the building very nearly did collapse into the main road. Yeah, terrifying. I mean, what compounded it actually was the next door neighbor, landowner, who was a very well-known developer at the time. And he used the most kind of incredible bully boy tactics against the client and myself as his architect while this project was on site. Now, this guy, he lived in, I think at the time, he owned the site next door, and he rented it out to fashion companies and stuff. And like I say, at the time, he was a very famous developer. He sponsored prizes at the AJ and all this sort of stuff. So he's not the kind of person that you want to piss off as a young architect. It's quite powerful. He subsequently found out yesterday, actually, I did some Google searches to find out what he's up to, and all these companies have gone insolvent. So I kind of, you know, doesn't make me happy, but anyway, he'd have all his lawyers sending me faxes last thing on a Friday night, telling me that they were going to take out an injunction and stuff to prevent the client's builders from entering the site, all these sorts of things. The front facade of this building nearly fell into the road on Chepstow Road, because as we stripped off the stucco from the front of the building, we discovered that this 9-inch thick oak beam, which was holding up 2 stories of Georgian brickwork, was so rotten that you could stick your pinky into it. And so obviously we had to get a whole load of temporary works, prop the entire facade, and get a new steel beams in and all the rest of it. But we had to do this so urgently, we couldn't ask for permission from the next door neighbour. We didn't actually need permission because the client had title to be able to do that sort of work, but nonetheless it wound this guy up the wrong way. So I got this sort of 20-page fax from his lawyers that 6 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, which for a young architect fresh out of part 3 is absolutely terrifying. And the thing is that it was to no end. This guy didn't get anything from it. You know, he wasn't losing any money. He wasn't making any money. He was just doing it to be anyway, human nature. But most of all, the most stressful thing on this project was the contractor. The contractor was, frankly, an imbecile. So I thought I'd just give you an idea of a very typical chain of correspondence, if this thing works. Okay, so this is an email from me to the builder. This is actually quite close to the end of the project. The client had so many variations. While you're on site, the thing that you should always try and avoid is a variation. That's when the client asks you to change something in the build, even though you're building it already. It's always a nightmare. It always costs more money. Every project has them. It's inevitable, but you try and minimize them. Anyway, this client, he'd be changing everything left, right, and center. It was just, you know, he treated it as his prerogative. And I suppose it is as the client's, but nonetheless. One of his variations was he wanted all of the walls in the upper studios to be magnetic so that he could stick his pictures of his Bugattis and his Audis on the wall without using pins, because he hated pin boards. And this only occurred to him right at the end of the project. So we had to strip off all the plaster and then put all these metal panels up on the wall and then paint the metal panels with special paint so it looked like the rest of the walls in the building. It's kind of ridiculous kind of process. Cost him thousands of pounds just to put these bits of steel up in the wall. You know, crazy. Anyway, discovered that the builder, for whatever reason at this point, had decided not to put these metal panels on. I think he was just fed up with the client. He was just refusing to sort of humor any more changes. So here's me writing, doing my architect thing, serving the client, writing to the builder saying, please you let me know what's going on with the metal panels. Get this reply from the builder. And it's always a bit terrifying. It's always a bit terrifying when you see an email where the kind of the uppercase is inverted. You kind of wonder, and then when you read the first sentence, we believe we have the metal panels, and it's sort of like, well, are you really in control of your own mind here? You know, we will not however, be in a position to put them up. So clearly, you do have them. You're just not going to put them up. So then me being the recently kind of graduated, you know, me with my part 3, practically with my diploma in my hand, shaking it at the builder, write this very sort of officious email, very pompous email. Please return them to site immediately. Any damage whatsoever to the panels will require their replacement by yourselves. Blah, blah, blah. Your original contract is compounded by these further obligations you've made with the client. You know, very sort of, you can always tell someone who's just got their part 3 when they're working in the office. Tim will say the same thing. Because Tim and I get copied in on all the correspondence where it's to do with contract running. And you can always tell the moment that someone's got their part 3, the tone of their emails changes to this. It gets... You know, it's like they've got this diploma in their back pocket and they're terribly pleased with themselves and they're going to let everyone know that they are the architect with a capital A. Anyway, so I sent this email to him, which actually, it's all factually correct and contractually correct. And then this is the reply I get back from him. Which I sort of don't need to go into, really. But so this is just the way that all of the kind of correspondence. This is the form of all of our correspondence on the project, actually. So this, plus this guy, this sort of very experienced, wealthy builder who's sending me these faxes through his lawyers, the whole thing is kind of incredibly, and the building's about to fall over and all this sort of stuff. It's incredibly sort of stressful. And the client's worrying about, you know, millimeter here and there. You know, it's just kind of ridiculous process, which just reminds you that doing this kind of real stuff is a really good spur to chasing riskier projects, i.e. competitions, where you have to commit your time and money with no expectation of getting it back, because actually that's where the fun is to be had. There's only a certain amount of fun to be had on site. So this is a competition, actually a very recent one. It's got nothing to do with the previous project particularly, it's certainly not chronologically, but I just sort of throw it in there as a competition to kind of maybe spend a minute talking about. I think I'm at slide 373 of 590. So what I'll probably do to save everyone from being terribly bored is I'll dwell on this project a little bit and then I'll sort of skip through things a bit. I'll increase the pace a bit and then we can spend the time just talking, you know, Q&A. This is a project that my students from last year, Jasper, will recognise, Cheng, because this was your site in Morocco. This is in the Medina of Fez. There was an open international competition back in 2010, I think it was, that attracted something crazy like 1,000 expressions of interest, and then there were 400 entries for this competition. It was just absolutely kind of incredible number of submissions. Had a really fantastic jury. Matthias Sauerbruck from the AA, but also Germany, he was a German architect. A whole bunch of Italians, a whole load of French. David Chipperfield was on the jury. You know, it was a very sort of heavyweight jury. But regardless of what you think of their work, these were serious architects. This was a serious project. It was backed by the US government. They had donated 393 million US as the kind of, they were bankrolling this and a couple of other projects, admittedly, with State Department money. So no wonder it attracted so many entries. Our entry, well, I mean, you can see at the sort of right-hand side of that image, that's the kind of context we're dealing with. The Medina of Fez is an absolutely extraordinary place. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the entire Medina. It's one of the largest World Heritage Sites in the world. It's the largest contiguous car-free urban zone. It's all pedestrianised, it's all donkey, as Jasper knows. It's a really kind of phenomenal place, particularly for someone who's obviously spent their whole life in the UK. So this is a board from our first stage submission. And we put this together extremely quickly because, well, we were kind of a bit half, I think it's fair to say we weren't entirely sure if we were going to do it or not. And then we sort of, well, Bethany's doing some sketches and, we might as well, we better had. So we spent a couple of days putting this together at the end. And you can sort of see in that top right-hand corner, the existing buildings are very sort of confined, very close, packed very closely together. And the competition was centered around that larger open space in the middle of the image, and then the river channel, which sort of winds its way up on the right-hand side. The competition was partly about creating entirely new buildings. It was partly about restoring old buildings, and it was partly about improving kind of circulation, what have you. So we took the view that we were going to be very precise with where we created new kind of incisions into the fabric. We were going to effectively kind of create, I suppose we called them sort of circulatory sutures, i.e. we were going to sort of thread new links through this existing very dense fabric, which was partially ruined, partially still standing. In a way, the whole project's about knitting. We were sort of quite vague at this stage, but certainly the text was very kind of specific about how we were going to be very flexible in what should be restored and what should be preserved and what should be simply cut out. You know, we weren't going to be dogmatic in our approach. We were going to be very responsive to what we saw on site and all this sort of thing. I suppose in terms of the kind of architectural finishes side of things, if you look at the bottom right-hand side there, there's a sort of sequence of images that we very quickly put together. That's the existing context. It's the idea of cutting into that context, you know, treating it as sort of malleable material, where we cut into it, create a new circulation route through it, and then create a little pocket that can be used as a courtyard. So you can then have more retail, you can have more craftsmen, you can have more kind of life around the part of the site. And then the third image there shows that we would slot in, our new architecture would actually be relatively modest. It would just be slotting in these little pieces of various materials, sort of some in keeping with the site and some very much not in keeping with the site. And that was really it. That was the project. There were a couple of quite big new buildings. There's some plans on the left-hand side there that they needed as part of the program. But fundamentally, it was about sort of repairing the existing fabric. We were absolutely delighted to be shortlisted down to the last 8. Excuse me. Like I say, you know, there's hundreds, 400 odd entries, so it's absolutely sort of a remarkable thing. And you can see this is the plan of our submission. We've never been involved in a competition quite like this. The first stage was just 3 A0 boards. The second stage was, I think, 12 or 14 A0 boards, plus a massive model, plus a great big report. I mean, it was fine because they paid us about £50,000 just to do the second stage. So it made sense financially, as it were, and we could throw the entire office onto this for, I don't know, best part of 2 months, I think it was. You can look at the plan, and this is where we're looking at existing buildings. Now we put in very, very precisely sort of positioned bits of new wall. We cut out bits of old wall. And we're very kind of relaxed about the different sorts of functions that can start to take place. We're very sort of interested in difference between the different bits of activity, whether it's kind of craftsman or whether it's retail or whether it's even accommodation. The beautiful thing about the Medina is how all these different programs and uses are kind of jammed together in a really kind of ad hoc way, and we didn't want to disrupt that too much with our scheme. We wanted to sort of facilitate it even more. But at the same time, putting in these relatively large new structures, but doing it in such a way that, I mean, another fantastic thing about the Medina is that as you walk through the streets, you have no idea what's behind certain buildings, what was behind certain facades, the riads and the dars and the caravanserai, the buildings where the traders used to live and do their work, are very sort of bland on the outside and then absolutely extraordinary, like completely different world on the inside, and we want to sort of continue that a little bit with our scheme. So you can see here in this rendering bits of the existing. This is actually coming into the site from one of the streets on the perimeter. And you can see a new piece that we put at the bottom end. It's also about how we deal with the river channel that runs through the site, so it's about planting and what have you. How we deal with existing buildings, whether we put entirely new bits of fabric hard up against stuff that we're preserving, or are we going to restore it, such as here where it's partly restored and it's partly entirely new, or where we're cutting these new routes through existing fabric and we're looking to use kind of, this only got to a very initial stage, but the pattern that you see on the wall there, we were trying to develop an algorithm to generate a sort of pattern. So it had nothing to do with the actual literal meaning of a lot of the carvings that you see in the Medina, but it has a sort of a visual, it has a lot visually to do with it. We're not interested in trying to ape a kind of Islamic carving, but we were very interested in the way in which those patterns were sort of developed and the kind of formal language that they generated. And there's one of the boards talking about that and the kind of different ways in which we look at the material treatments. It's another board looking at, I think this is about the different types of program, but then also at the top, a sort of survey of existing window protection that there is in the Medina. It's absolutely fantastic cast iron gratings and things. And we're looking with the line drawing roughly in the middle of the page, looking to develop our own sort of pattern, again, based on an algorithm that would be used on some of the new building elements. I don't particularly like this image, but that kind of starts to show a little bit about what I'm talking about. This is perhaps more successful in terms of talking about the existing building that we are restoring on the left, existing building that we're preserving as a semi-ruin on the right, adding a new part above it, and then a new part sort of sandwiched between. So there's a whole range of different strategies for dealing with the program that's required. I'm pleased to say we came third on this in the end. We had the second highest number of votes for first place. So we were so close to winning it, and we were, at once absolutely blown away and amazed that we got anywhere, but at the same time really disappointed because we found out that we were actually incredibly close to winning what would have been, project, well, I don't know if project of our lives, but it would have been a pretty good start. Anyway, this is a real project which has some of the same sorts of things, some of the same sorts of concerns. I suppose I'm showing this again to sort of reiterate the point that you want to try and keep your options open. You want to try and pursue different work because every work, all the work that you do has some sort of merit. There's always something in a project that you can focus on to tease out some sort of value to yourself as a practitioner, as an architect. It doesn't need to be a big project in the Medina Affairs to get you excited. You can be just as excited, for example, about a very, very humble ramp in a little market town in the southwest of England. This is we call this a bridge. It is a bridge, sort of, but really it's just a ramp. It's a ramp that goes from the park at the end of that, in the middle of the picture, to a new town square behind the camera. This is in Taunton in Somerset. This is the castle is Taunton Castle, which is also the Somerset County Museum. It's a Grade 1 listed building. The green stuff on the ground, the grass on the ground, is a dried up moat, which is a scheduled ancient monument. There's a whole load of English Civil War dead. And they required this bridge as part of a wider urban regeneration kind of project to sort of sort out problems in the town centre. And we were commissioned to design this little bridge. There's only so much you can do with such a simple brief. It's a ramp. There's very, very tight geometric constraints in terms of where one end of the bridge has to go and where the other end of the bridge has to go. There's practically a straight line connecting those two things. We were just able to pull it off the straight line. So there's this very, very gentle curve. So it's sort of, what we say is it genuflects to the tower. It sort of acknowledges the tower very subtly. That's all we were really able to do. And then you can't really see in this picture, but this bridge looks relatively long in this photograph. And then it looks relatively short looking the other direction in this photograph. That's because the bridge has a taper to it. So it sort of prolongs your journey down from the square into the garden, and then it visually shortens your journey from the garden up to the square. Now, it's complete visual contrivance, but it sort of makes sense in the context. The square is a very busy part of town. The garden is much more kind of, well, pastoral. It's a garden after all. So, there's not a huge amount that you can do with a project like this creatively, but you can nonetheless try and get what you can out of it. This is the lighting at night. And then that's the sort of, you can see it's effectively a viaduct. Very simple. That bridge is actually part of a scheme that has 3 bridges to it, and I'll just sort of scoot through them now. The other 2 aren't built yet. We hope they will be built. This is a bridge over the river, which is a thing called a tide arch. The idea is that all these bridges have the same sort of detailed language. Like I say, it's a very modest scheme. There's a very limited amount of money available for it, so you can't reinvent the wheel each time, but you can always get something from it. And here we wanted to design the most sort of simple and elegant tide arch that we could, and viaduct, obviously, for the first bridge. And then also this is a simply supported beam over a small mill stream. So, like I say, there's only so much of an opportunity for design when you've got such kind of constrained brief. But nonetheless, you should try and sort of eke out what you can. Similarly with this project, which is not too far away from those bridges, is another bridge. It's actually, we designed this as a footbridge, but it's actually a road bridge. It carries full highway loading. It carries lots of traffic. It's a very busy road. But like I say, it's in a very beautiful part of Taunton as well, actually. The 2 projects are not unrelated. We sort of won one off the back of the other. And I'll sort of skip through this. There's not a tremendous amount to say other than that it's a bridge that very much privileges the pedestrian over the vehicle. And one of the things that we got involved in was designing some benches on this bridge, which sort of leads me to another sort of strand of work that we're interested in, which is product design. This is an open competition that we won for a design of a chair. This was back in, I don't know when this was exactly, 2006 or something. In manufacturer called Tacchini. It's a beautiful thing, really comfortable, all the rest of it. Unfortunately, the kind of global economic crash happened, and Tacchini, well, they're still around, but they didn't have the kind of capital to be able to speculate on a new product. So it's kind of, I think the prototypes are all sitting in a shed in northern Italy somewhere. This is a rendering, these aren't the prototypes. And then this is another open competition that we won. This is for a drinking fountain for the Royal Parks. This is much more recent. We won this back in 2010, which is a very interesting kind of brief, actually. It's design a new drinking fountain for use in all of London's royal parks. So you're including kind of really historic places next to Buckingham Palace, St James's Park and Green Park and all the rest of it, as well as places like Primrose Hill, Richmond Park, Greenwich Park, Bushy Park. All these places have very, very different characters, and yet they wanted a fountain that could be used in all of these places whether grade 1 listed or not, and yeah, it's a very sort of difficult challenge. Also, you know, working as a product designer is a very different way of working to working as an architect normally. You can see the fountain it's a bronze fountain in large part, which is sort of very interesting. You learn a lot about different materials by sort of exposing yourself to different competitions and pursuing different lines of work. This is the only thing we've done in bronze, but bronze is a fascinating material. It's been around, obviously, been in use since the Bronze Age, and yet we're coupling it with, I wouldn't make any claims as to being how advanced this computer modeling is, but it's very precise computer modeling, such that this model that you see here, and there's a rendering of it, becomes the data that creates the master for the mold that you saw in the bronze photographs earlier on. And you can see that's with the drain element taken away. I always look at this, and this photograph kind of freaks me out. It's quite sort of bodily, and sort of find it slightly disturbing, so I quickly go to that one, which has the lid back on. And then this is the actual prototype fountain next to it was Kensington Palace. This was installed back in the end of 2011, and there's now a whole bunch of these things being rolled out across the parks. The second one was installed actually last summer, and then there's another 5 or 6 going in the next month or so, I think in Greenwich and Bushy Park, and then there's more coming later on this year. So they're going to be sort of all over the royal parks before too long, and then we've had inquiries from lots of other places as well, which is all rather nice. But I think the key thing is that as an architect, working on something like that is very, very different to working on a building. The level of functional detailing that you have in something like a fountain is virtually never matched in architecture. There's obviously a very big difference between product design and architecture in terms of scale. There's a less obvious difference in the sense that product design tends to be instrumental in a way that architecture generally isn't. What I mean by that is that the fountain has a very clear brief, which is to deliver safely deliver clean, fresh water, and that's very instrumental, if you like. That's what it does. Whereas buildings need to do all sorts of stuff like context, far more complex and overlapping requirements. You know, the economics tend to be much more complex. So they're very different beasts, and if they are instrumental at all, the instrumentality is so bound up in all sorts of other issues that you never have the same sort of clarity that you have with a piece of product design. So doing this sort of product design thing is terribly refreshing for an architect. But I would say the same thing about bridges, actually. Bridges also have this kind of clarity and this instrumentality. Cedric Price once said that no one should be interested in the design of bridges. And I mean, I have to sort of disagree with the great man, because obviously I'm very interested in designing bridges, and as a practice we're involved in quite a lot of them. But I think he said this precisely because of their, what I call the pure instrumentality of them. There's not much to them, certainly when you compare them to buildings. You know, essentially they just connect A to B, and that's it. So in that sense, bridges are pure design. I mean, they can relate to context. So you can see there's a bridge that we've designed in the background of this much larger structure in the foreground. But really, the design of them comes down to a discussion about, well, you never really have programmatic complexity with a bridge. It's all about function in the sense that it's an artifact fulfilling one single kind of problem. It's like it's proper problem solving. It's almost like I say, it's pure design. You're designing something to solve a very specific problem, and then that's virtually it. So I'll sort of fly through these bridges just to, I'm probably going on a bit actually. This is a stressed ribbon bridge. It's 300 meters long, and it's only 15 centimeters deep in the middle of the span, which is kind of remarkable when you think about the normal rule of thumb for structure is kind of 1/20. This is an opening bridge down in Shoreham on the south coast of England we were shortlisted on. We've designed this bridge. It's a viaduct, much like that bridge next to the castle that I showed you earlier. But here you have the structure sort of taking place on alternate sides of the bridge, so it gives the impression of longer spans. the actual opening section is kind of concealed within the body of the bridge. You can see the break lines there. This is a bridge that's sort of self-initiated. Sometimes we'll do a project just to sort of have a play around with an idea. So here we're looking at a very simple structure, very rudimentary truss. And is there something that we can do with the truss to make it sort of slightly more delightful or slightly more interesting? This is a bridge that we're working on currently. This is in Scotland. Marcus was saying that we have a base up in Scotland, which is, we've only had it really for a couple of months now, but this is our first project. I should say this is a bridge over the River Dee. It's actually near Balmoral Castle, so it's near where Prince Charles likes to live. So as a result, we're going to have to enter into some dialogue with him. So as a result of that, we put together this slide, which shows all of the other suspension bridges across this river. And the idea is that we're going to convince him that our bridge fits within that typology, albeit one that's sort of suitable for modern codes and all the rest of it. You can see here that we've got the pylons that hold the bridge up are in a kind of a V shape, which means that the suspension cables come down to form a valley, which means in turn that the deck is stiffened by the cables coming in at an inclined angle, which means in turn that we don't need stiffening under the deck. So the bridge becomes a lot thinner as a result, almost like a wafer. So we're using geometry in order to achieve something very simple, which is just to keep this thing as slender as possible in what is quite a beautiful site. Like I say, bridge design is quite pure design. In a sense, there's not much to it, but that's actually where the delight is. This is another bridge. This is one that we finished, I don't know, 2011. We won the competition for this bridge. I think it was in the same year. I mean, this was an incredible project, not in terms of the design necessarily, but in terms of the process. This bridge had to be designed, procured, built, completed, opened within 12 months, which is a tremendous learning experience. More to the point for us, it was a very good learning experience in terms of steelwork fabrication and what can be done with steelwork fabrication. So going back to the earlier point about diversity of projects and seeing stuff being built helps you in terms of your knowledge of processes, helps you in terms of your knowledge of what can be done and how quickly. So that brings me to the project that Marcus mentioned earlier on, the tower in Taipei, well not in Taichung rather, in Taiwan, where the brief was for I can't remember the height of the building. I think it was just over 350 meters. This slide shows you kind of due diligence. That's what lawyers call due diligence, which is to do your proper research before you actually get stuck into the case. So I won't really dwell on this. You can see a section of the site, obviously the tower site. It's that kind of coloured in section. And then looking at the site in plan view, the different types of program that are required by the brief, and then what those different types of program are, broken down. Like I say, this is fairly dry due diligence stuff, but it does help you to sort of formulate an approach to the design. So you can see in the top diagram how the program, certain amounts of program is required at the bottom of the building, certain amounts of program is required at the top of the building, and then in between there's a whole lot of nothing, which is a challenge for a designer. I mean, you're used to designing towers which have some sort of program all the way up them. This is a sort of curious thing. And then there's an idea about what's important at the top and the bottom. Where would you rather be when you're at the top or the bottom? And then here is a diagram where we're looking at the bottom, where we're looking at, okay, the height is fixed by the brief. How thick does this tower need to be in order to achieve all that program? So you can see on the left-hand side, that's all of the program fitted into the volume. So it's evenly spread. And then towards the right, obviously, where the program, the floor plates effectively get bigger and bigger, so the program can separate out. And it's about sort of picking a point between those two extremes. I'll speed up, I think. So here we're looking to use a thing called Voronoi geometry as a way of defining the structure. And weirdly, this came back from that bridge that I just showed you with the big bits of steel being bent. Because on that project, we saw how straightforward it was to fabricate certain types of junction with tubular steel. I mean, everyone can look at sort of high-tech architecture books and can see how nodal connections are made, but it was news to us just quite how simple it was to create very, very complex geometric connections with welded steel using robotic welding techniques. So that kind of freed us up to think less about, say, 90-degree angles, less about kind of conventional node connections, and more about actually the geometry can be anything you want, and it's still very economic to build with the sort of software that these steel fabrication yards are using these days. That came from the bridge, which then led to this sort of approach, because we were very interested in creating a kind of almost like a sort of a foam. At the scale of this tower, it would have no kind of directionality to it. It would have no sort of hierarchy to the structure. It would be literally like foam. And that came, again, from the brief. The brief asked for something that was very specific to Taiwanese culture, and I'll spare you the kind of cod philosophy that went into this, but that's why we were trying to achieve this sort of effect. And you can see we're looking at filling in the cells of this Voronoi geometry at the top and the bottom with actual built volumes. So this is actual programmed space, and then obviously far right connecting it with some lifts. And then that's what you end up with. I mean, the budget for this project was quite healthy, I seem to remember. And we're very confident, very comfortable that this project could have been delivered within that budget. Towards the end of the process, we didn't have them in the team at the start, but we had, I think it was Gardner and Theobald, a big QS firm, as well as Arabs, structural people, working with us on the project. So we had a lot of confidence in this, particularly after, again, working on that bridge and having an understanding of just how straightforward making some of these connections would be. And you can see the sort of the visual effect, the architectural effect in different sort of lighting conditions, how certain types of weather will emphasize the structure, certain types of weather will emphasize the tops, and then at night you get this sort of seemingly weightless volume hovering above the city. This is another project in Taichung. We got an honourable mention in this. So again, we quite nearly made it onto into the second stage. This is for the new art gallery or art centre. It kind of combines a whole bunch of different functions. It's art gallery, it's theatre, it's performance space, it's kind of cultural institute. All quite rigorously defined in the brief. I mean, what you find with the better competitions actually have briefs that are incredibly detailed. So that's half the battle, is getting that detail, and they provide it for you. So actually it's just a question, it's not like your projects here at the Bartlett where you need to sort of understand yourself what needs to go into your building. That's given to you, so you can kind of get stuck into the design. Our idea here is that we'd have a very sort of normative structure, a very normative architecture from the outside. This would be broken down into very sort of straightforward programmatic chunks, and the adjacencies of these bits of program has followed our interpretation of what would be required, or the most effective way of setting the thing out in a very sort of pragmatic and straightforward way. But then the architecture, if you like, came about in terms of what we did between these bits of program in terms of the public space. We were very interested in making the building a very public space, almost like a big sort of city room that anyone could come through. This building would have been situated in the park. We're very interested in the building being a continuation of that park. So here you are looking at the sort of the interstitial spaces between those bits of volume and the sort of geometries that we could use, and we're sort of having a think about what those different spaces would mean. And then that leads on to the kind of the building proper, as it were, and the sort of forms that we're dealing with. Obviously, as well, the connections between those bits of program. The plan for this building is actually incredibly straightforward. I haven't got it here, but it's really all about the kind of complexity and the richness that can come through in these interstitial spaces between the bits of program, and the opportunities that affords for different types of occupation. So again, it's a continuation of the park. If you think about a bit of landscape in the city, a bit of parkland, it often has very, very formally specific spaces. If you think about Central Park in New York is always the best example, but even Regent's Park, really kind of specific bits of topography and trees and planting and all the rest of it, but there's absolutely no kind of program that's been assigned to it. It's just there for people to occupy in a certain way, however they see fit. You're providing the opportunity for, means of occupation that you hadn't predicted, and that's very much what this sort of thing is about. The timer on this says 1 hour 10 minutes. Is that true? Christ, I'll speed up. Okay, so here we're looking at how these bits of volumes will kind of ramp up and create apertures between them. So you're effectively creating a series of stage sets from one bit of public space to another bit of public space, and the idea is that people could, put on productions, or they could. There'd be suitable places for sort of exterior artwork, or it's keeping it flexible but allowing different ways of occupying the space. That leads me on to this project, which is completely different. This is our first project for the Arts Council England. This is an interior fit out really for their offices in Brighton, where we are looking to do pretty much the same thing in this project as we were trying to do in that art gallery in Taiwan, obviously with much more limited means. Here we're looking to use, they had a very sort of fixed idea of what they wanted the different teams to be working on. They wanted sort of specific spaces that we'd be creating within this larger office space, but they also they didn't want any sort of overbearing hierarchy between people working in teams, and they wanted some sort of relationship between those teams. So the idea here is that all these pieces that we put in that were created sort of dividers between those spaces will also become like the kind of stage sets. So you'd be framing different activities in the office and creating this sort of sense of parallax as well, with the idea that you'd have a space that had almost a theatrical quality to it. It's almost like you're looking at a TV screen or at a stage set or at a cinema screen. It works quite well. I think people use the space in quite a playful way. You can probably most effectively see it there. And leading back to that project. This is another project for the Arts Council. I think I'll just fly through and then we can have Q&A because it's gone on a bit. Okay. Arts Council, more Arts Council, trying to develop similar themes. This is the third project for the Arts Council. This is their Birmingham office. And then that led on to this project, I think. And then some private residential stuff. I'll sort of skip through. There's more emails that I could talk about. This one is kind of funny, actually, because this was actually a fight with a client rather than the contractor this time. The client had... when you're an architect, you have to tell the client when he's going to pay the builder. And the client shouldn't pay the builder unless you've told him to pay the builder, because you have to sign off the work. Unfortunately, this client, we signed off, I think it was about £20,000 worth of work, and told the client to pay the builder. The client then decided to completely ignore that advice, or that instruction rather, and pay the builder £6,000, so a shortfall of £14,000, and expect that the work would just somehow miraculously carry on. Effectively, he was undermining our role as architects, and we had to resign at that point because the way in which the contract was written between the builder and him meant that we had to deal with all the payments. He was ignoring that. We were effectively vetoed. We had to resign. That's the professional thing that you need to do. So we did. But he nonetheless kept asking us for advice and asking us to sort out the builder, and it sort of culminated in this this exchange at the end where he sent the same email to me. I think it was about 70 times over the course of an hour and a half. Really kind of remarkable what building projects do to people, particularly when it's their own home. I mean, people working on their own home where the family live, all the rest of it, it's obviously very personal to them, and some people can't really cope with it, and this guy couldn't. It sort of went on. This is a lovely little project we completed a few years ago. This is actually for a former student of mine from the Bartlett. There you go, Bartlett connection. I taught this guy when he was in second year. This was during my first year of teaching, and he's a rather fortunate chap. He's managed to buy himself an entire house in de Beauvoir town, and we were his architect. He finished this a couple of years ago. Quite a nice, fairly humble, straightforward little project. Quite jolly. And we're now his brother's architect in Marylebone. And this is actually for his mother in Chelsea. This is finished now. We haven't had it photographed, but we need to get that sorted out. This is another nice little project, a tiny project. So the project in Chelsea had a sort of astronomical budget. The floors that we laid, the timber floor had a supply budget of £450 a square metre. If you think that normally you can get timber floor for about £40 a square metre, and then you add a couple, add 20, 30 quid to lay it, this is £450 per square metre. I mean, you could practically build you could build half a building for that. If you think, you can do a building for about £1,000, £1,200 a square metre. She was spending a third of that just on the floor. Absolutely incredible. This is the other end of the spectrum. This is a very, very humble project in Murray Mews in Camden. I don't know if any of you know Murray Mews, but it's a sort of incredible street that has, it's like a kind of architectural zoo. It has the first building by Rogers and Foster. It has buildings by Cullinans. It has buildings by, I think, Terry Farrell. All these kind of architects, and we did this building at the top end of it. Finished it a couple of years ago. Very humble, very small budget. It's converting a coach house into basically a family home. The idea is that we build this metal screen out the front, which kind of takes over a bit of what was pavement, although it was actually, we found out it was in the title of the clients. They owned this bit of pavement. I think they were aware of it, but they weren't really thinking about it. And we said, well, we can take that pavement and you can make it part of your own sort of domain. The street is full of quite tough approaches to the public domain, so we're quite happy building a big metal wall. And the planners were very happy with us as well, so that's fine. And then inside, like I say, it's very straightforward kind of thing, very low budget. It's more about working out what not to do than what you are going to do. So keeping as much of the kind of reinforced concrete soffit, and it's all very nice and straightforward. But we kind of fell out with them as well, or rather the builder fell out with them. This is another case of a client. Whereas in the previous project, with the email that the guy sent me 70 odd times, he picked completely the wrong moment to have a fight with a builder. He was only halfway through his project, and then he decided not to pay the builder properly, and then still expected to come back on site. No chance. So he had a half-finished house, all these screaming kids, all the rest of it, and winter was coming. No, nightmare. These people are much, much smarter. They waited until right at the end of the project before they said, right, sod you, builder, we're not going to pay the money we owe you. So this led to sort of weeks of arguing between the builder and the client, and of course us, and our contractual position was always, you need to pay the builder. That's the money that they're owed, and that's the money we've certified. Eventually, the client relented and said, okay, we'll pay the builder. And then the builder sent us this email, what's this guy on? Getting the retention will be fun, i.e. the money that's left over for another year. Can't get the image of client in his red miniskirt dressing gown yesterday morning out of my head. And this is all kind of very amusing until Tim pointed out that it was sent to the client's wife as well. So the red bit of redacting there is the client's wife. So of course we thought we had agreement and the builder was going to get his £25,000, and then the builder sent this, accidentally copied in the wife, and then back to square one, and this whole project ended in, well, for us it was kind of a tragedy. The whole thing was an absolute nightmare of arguing and legality and the worst kind of pain that you ever experience as an architect. Not quite in court, but not far off it. Hideous. Competition. I'll sort of skip through this. And then doing things for rich people as well. That was what I was going to talk about here. This is a house in the Bahamas. This is a villa that we're invited to do some designs for a series of villas in Qatar for the government. I could talk about this, I won't. I'll sort of scoot on. And this is a sort of antidote to doing rich people's houses, is to do something a bit more kind of grubby and gritty. This is a competition to reuse the what they call the Brussels Law Courts. It's an extraordinary building. This is another sort of rich person's house in Notting Hill this time. We've actually finished this. We've not had it photographed yet. We'll get it photographed very soon. There's another email. This is the sort of antidote to all the other emails. So this is the lady whose house I've just shown you. She's very, very famous, very glamorous TV kind of star. And she sent us this sort of really beautiful, or beautifully patronizing, slightly sexist email. Hello boys. I mean, that is sort of, anyway. But fundamentally, it's a lovely email to get, and saying that she's very happy with us and all the rest of it. And we've subsequently had emails from another very glamorous, sort of extraordinary kind of woman. Actually, today had another email from her, who we may be doing her house in Chelsea. So, it's quite a good line of work. And I was going to talk a little bit about Scotland. This is a Skerryvore lighthouse in the Hebrides. This is, I think, probably the most famous lighthouse in the UK. Certainly one of the tallest. Certainly the most remote. Built by the Stevensons, absolutely sort of incredible family. Robert Louis Stevenson was a very famous writer that everyone knows about. Everyone else in his family were building lighthouses, but we're doing this one, not Skerryvore. This is also by the Stevensons. This is on the North Sea coast. Marcus Stockton, who some of you know, is one of my students from last year, is the project architect. Can't call him that. He's only part one, but he's effectively the project architect on this project, and it's a lovely little project to convert, restore, renovate, and extend this wee lighthouse. Our new part is off to the left there, and the old part is pretty obvious. New part is sort of separated by access up onto the roof that we're providing. Should be a little gem of a project. This is rather nice, actually. We discovered that this is a section, obviously, through the lighthouse tower. Discovered very recently that there's a big pit underneath the tower where the counterweight for hoisting the lamp in and out used to be. So it's a nice opportunity for a wine cellar or something, a nice bit of product design to be done there. I'll just very quickly talk about this. This is a house very close to actually where I live now, and where our Scotland studio is. This is a project we're doing for the Secretary of Oxford University. She bought this quite recently. We are effectively going to duplicate the volume of the existing house, put it parallel to it, basically treble the size of this building. The reason I've included this is because not only are we going to be the architects, we're also going to be the builders. We've got the controlling stake in a contracting company up in Scotland, and this will be that company's first commercial project, which is something I was going to kind of dwell on as well, but I think I've kind of overrun. I'll finish on this. This is probably the loveliest project in the office. This is one that Tim's going to be looking after when it finally gets the proper go-ahead. This is for the Royal Parks. This is the Serpentine Lake that you can see in the background there. We got this project off the back of the fountain. This is a wee boathouse that I can't really talk about it, but we're going to extend it by doing that. And that's pretty much all I can say, actually, about this. It's confidential. It'd be a beautiful kind of project. Anyway, so I wanted to sort of finish on this, well, nearly finish on this slide. This is the penultimate slide. Diversity is very important. Hopefully the portfolio that you've seen and the different things that we kind of get involved in sort of demonstrate that diversity. It's very commercially useful, but it also means that things kind of, one thing feeds off the other, and that's very important to us. And we think a diverse approach to projects is really the only approach. People who try and make one project look more or less like the last project, I find it sort of very difficult to understand. These people who sort of do kind of Smithson's-esque brick boxes, for everything, and you've got to wonder why, because the Smithsons did it better because they were the Smithsons, but also how can you possibly shoehorn every project into one mode of working? So that was one thing I was going to leave you with, and then the second thing I was going to leave you with was this quote, which was a few years ago. Tim and I were in Helsinki at this kind of it was sort of like a symposium architectural competition thing. And there were architects from all over the world. I think we were one of 2 from the UK. And there was a guy from Australia, a guy called Peter Stutchbury, who's quite a good architect. He used to work for Glenn Merker, who's a very good architect. And the thing that he said on the last, and it was a sort of piss up. The whole weekend was sort of incredible party with lots of architects from all over the world and really sort of fascinating, interesting time. But the one thing he said, which is stuck in my mind, is to always go for the high bar, which is to say, always go for the seemingly unachievable thing. So whether that's Preston competition, or whether it's the Fez competition, or whether it's trying to pursue work that you've never been involved in before, irrespective of who you think the competition is, just always go for it, because at some point it will happen. But even if it doesn't, at least you're trying. I think that's the kind of message that I want to leave with. There you go. This also means we can go to a real bar.
Thank you, Ben. Are there any questions? It's the opportunity for the students.
Yeah. You can tell me how rubbish some of it is, or all of it.
You design lots of different diversity, like things like bridges and interior installations and stuff. Like, what is your ambitions like for the next, like the company, like another diversity? What's the next things that you want to achieve?
Yeah, brilliant question. I think that when I set up the practice, I didn't have a business plan, and when Tim joined, we've never had a business plan, other than to just do stuff. That is the plan: is to just get stuff done. Try and all the stuff I've been saying. But I suppose you can kind of separate it out a bit into stuff that's on site and that's definitely going to be on site, and there's no question that it's going to be built, and stuff that is a lot riskier and more speculative. And at the moment, it's very hard for us to bring those two things together. It's very hard for us to speculate with stuff that's going to be built, because the only stuff we're speculating with is such a long shot. It's all competitions. So the ambition is always to bring those things close together. Any architect will say the same. They want to be building interesting projects. But our strategy, such as it is to always be building stuff, because that demonstrates that you can build, but then also always be pursuing the speculative stuff, because that means that you're at least trying. And I suppose if I'm completely honest with myself, I'd say that that stuff, the speculative sort of stuff is quite closely aligned with a lot of the stuff that's being built. So if I'm being really honest, if there's a weakness, I think it's that we are not being speculative enough. And I think that in order to do that, we need to speculate in a way that isn't directed at a competition. Because competitions have set briefs, and you always try and win them, which means you always try and work out what the jury wants. So there's a bit of that game going on. And I think what we need to do is somehow decouple ourselves a little bit from that process in order to be able to properly interrogate our own ideas. Does that make sense? So in the same way that we've set up a contracting company to do a load of building work, I mean, building is deep down and dirty. The hope is that we'll be at some point in the future, we'll be more in control of the building, the real stuff, because we'll be building at least some of it, at least the stuff that's in Scotland. On the other hand, I think we do want to somehow work out a way that we can free up the speculative side to be much more adventurous than it is at the moment, because at the moment, the opportunity for being adventurous is in the competitions, and like I say, they have a brief. Briefs are good, but we want to. Yeah, that's the thing that I think we all miss, or maybe not the other guys in the practice so much, but Tim and I think miss from the being at the Bartlett. I love being tutor here, so I get a bit of that, but I want to do it myself. So, yeah, so.
I mean, actually, I just want to follow on that, and just remember when Tom Viscombe came to give a talk. It was not actually last time, it was the first time he came a few years ago. It must have been sort of 2006. And he was having the same sort of struggle as somebody who was teaching, who's academically involved, who has a lot of work published, who was not building. And his strategy at the time was, I am going to do it until I at some point will have the opportunity to do what I want to do. So in a sense, he had the same struggle, but he had a different strategy.
Yeah.
Which was, when compared with what you were saying, that you keep on building and using any opportunity to do it, even if it's a sort of slightly more mundane, straightforward piece of architecture, and you do the competitions in order to release your ideas and explore them. He was saying, I do not compromise until I at some point...
Yeah, but I think, you know, the question...
The question is obviously whether he had any opportunity to build or not, and he now got sort of a project in China. His firm went bankrupt, and he had to start again fresh. So he's not called, doesn't have the same name anymore. It has another sort of new event. I haven't met him, but I heard it was a complete nightmare. And he was just happy that he was actually in another country, otherwise it would have been really a real problem. But obviously one hears sort of stories how Zaha in her early days was saying that she does not compromise and give up.
It's easier for Zaha.
Obviously. But the point is, it is an interesting balance in a way, where to find how far do you push the agenda of what you build, how much do you reject even some work, how much do you stick to your own theoretical and conceptual ideas, how much do you even stick to your language, in a sense, and how much do you introduce diversity as a flexible sort of principle in order to keep on building. Because I think at the end of the day, what you demonstrate is that you're actually a builder. What you really like to do is to build. Not build in the sense that you sort of do what the builders, the contractors do. You actually really are a part of a group of architects who really want to build something. And I remember when I was a student, I had a teacher sort of classifying different types of architects and saying, no, he is really a builder. He can't sleep well if he doesn't build. You know, because that's really what he wants to do. And the rest is sort of irrelevant. Other people write articles, other people teach more, the other ones, you know, whatever they do. But he really wants to build. And that's the same comment I heard that Peter Cook made about Tom Main of Morphosis, that he's really a builder, can't sleep properly if he doesn't build. And so on. And so that's the family, a family of people who really feel sort of nervous and itchy if something's not going on site tomorrow or after tomorrow, because that's what really gives them sort of the real sense of achievement. Whether this is the perfect language or whether this is the perfect project actually becomes irrelevant, because it's about physically making something.
Yeah, I think the perfect project doesn't exist. On the one hand, there's always going to be compromise. Having said that, we're completely unapologetic about the work that is built. You know, all the projects are important to us, and there's always something in them that is interesting, at least for us, and useful. And also, we need to make a living. But again, that's not to apologise for it. It's just part of, I think, you know, we do want to build stuff. Yeah, we're architects of that sort, if you like. And like I say, the diversity it's actually something that we aim to achieve as well, because it does throw up all sorts of other issues that you get exposed to things that you wouldn't be exposed to otherwise. I'm not just referring to sort of silly conversations with builders that you've seen, but it's I think it's quite important.
I did have a question after all, before I wouldn't ask anything. But I just want to pick up on what you said about just doing stuff. Because I think that's, every time I've sort of sneakily gone onto the website to see what you've been up to, it's always like, not 3 new projects, but 20. So you're obviously doing a lot of stuff. And I mean, what I've always kind of thought about when looking at the work in practice is that it's very busy. It's kind of it doesn't matter what you're doing, that it's a real project that has to be on site, but you still throw in like 3 competitions in 1 week. And I think this urge of doing stuff and trying hard, I think is something that is, for all these guys in a way, it's the biggest lesson, because you only get to where you are in a way right now because you've done so many projects. And just by practicing you get better. I mean, Giuseppe, the teacher, keeps talking about doing gymnastics. So the more gymnastics you do, the better you get at it, and then you can go and compete. And then you'll win the more you practice. So I think that's really crucial for that kind of mindset. And it seems a little bit that a lot of people that might be really good at the Bartlett fall into a comfort zone after the Bartlett when there is a paid job and a salary, and suddenly you have your weekends free, hopefully, depending on who you work for. But just, I think you can tell that there are a few that come out of the school that want to keep pushing things and keep doing things. And I was dead scared when I left the Bartlett. I was like, oh my God, am I going to be competing with all these guys in my year, or the year after, or the year before?
And they just disappear.
Yeah, I don't know that most of them went after that. Because I thought, oh, everyone's going out, they're setting up their practice, they're going to be amazing, and they're going to take over the world. And actually, very few have the kind of energy to do it, because, I mean, you have to do this many projects, I think, in order to actually sustain yourself and to survive as a practice. So I think that's, for me, in the way what taking away from this lecture is that, just keeping busy and keep at it.
I read, it's weird because I read an interview with, this morning on the plane down here, I read an interview with, what's his name? American entrepreneur, kind of, not Amazon, Google, founders of Google, Sergey Brin and Larry Page. It was an interview with Larry Page, and he was saying how their policy is basically just to keep doing stuff. Because, I mean, they're obviously in a hugely privileged position. He's in his, late 40s or something. And, you know, Google, if you compare Google to Apple, Apple do a couple of things, like an iPod, a phone, TV, and a laptop, and that's it. They do them really well. Whereas Google do all sorts of stuff. And in fact, they get to the level where Google are just trying to think of stuff to do, think of stuff to spend their money on. So the kind of driverless cars, the glasses, you know, all these different projects. Vaccinations in the Bay Area in San Francisco, you know, random projects, just trying to push the boundaries here and there, wherever they can. And, you know, he was just making the point that you compare them to Apple, obviously very successful, but Apple are doing nothing by comparison. And I think that's very sort of fascinating. And I think that if I could say anything about that, it would be that, you know, obviously not comparing myself to Larry Page, that's completely ridiculous, but that is a much more appealing model to be trying to do stuff. And it's, you know, this quote is, again, you know, always go for the high bar. You've always got to be doing something, otherwise what's the point? You know, why did you go to the Bartlett if you're not going to then try and push it and do something with it? I think. Hello.
So now personally I'm getting very fascinated on construction details and drawings, but yes, as you know, there's always, I just feel like there's always so much to learn in terms of details, and it seems it's not enough just from construction drawings. So from your talk, and it seems you start to develop some of your details through your previous work. But for us as young professionals or students, do you have any suggestions for us to develop construction details or
Well, it depends on the project. I mean, you know, it's a bit of a conceit what I've done with the presentation by saying that this led on to that and that led on to that. It's not always as kind of linear as that, but certainly similarities and things that you learn from one to the next thing. So I wouldn't say that, oh, we did that on that project, so now we're going to do it again on this project, we'll just change it slightly. It doesn't really work like that. You're designing, and detailing is just designing. You know, it's the same sort of mentality detailing as there is with coming up with the concept for the building or working out the layout or whatever. You know, one's maybe more strategic than the other, but you are still just acting as a designer. So it's up to you to design it, and whether you can borrow things from previous projects or not, I don't think is, you know, you might look at other things, but if you go through the process of focusing on, you know, how does it need to be connected, what's it doing, how can I achieve what it needs to do, then it's just the design process. I can't really answer it, that's what you're paid to do.
I just wanted to ask you, you're talking about you want to free up time to do some more speculative projects and things like that, and you're talking about kind of having agendas, especially within the university, kind of pushing us to look at what our agendas as designers are.
Yeah.
What would you choose as your kind of
Don't know just yet, or at least it's so half-baked that I'm not going to say it now. Sorry.
One thing I would like to comment on is, because I remember so well the work exercise that you did as a student in your 5th year, and I said it in the introduction that it was extraordinary work, not just architecturally, in terms of the spatial organization and language, etc., but there were these absolutely beautiful renderings. They were really, really incredible. You wouldn't show them nowadays, and they would be still great. And that for a rendering to sort of stand time is quite an achievement, because renderings become sort of old-fashioned quite quickly. And I noticed that there are two aspects in your work, in your presentations, came across very clearly. One was that you or others that work with you, and obviously Tim, are extremely good communicators, which I think is a fact that an architect nowadays has to be. And I would say that you're for sure a good communicator in person, but through the work all had a sort of atmospheric touch and a sort of level of moment. And I think for the competitions and the success that you have had in competitions, and I remember that from the Taiwan one, it was one of the key things, is that there was a sort of mood in the renderings which was very appealing. The jury at the time was composed out of several people, and there were quite a few Taiwanese, and they didn't get why this project was for Taiwan and your interpretation of sort of Chinese culture. But beyond that, there was a lot of sort of fascination with the mood of the renderings. Sort of, the mood was the right one, but the thing seemed not to have the right symbology, or whatever the reason was for those people that were in the jury. But this issue of mood and atmospheric quality that comes through the communication that you had already in those renderings, I think is a very strong tool. And the other one that I also remember is a very simple diagrammatic explanation that is clear and simple and gets to the point, which again I think is extremely difficult often when you see work that has lots of sort of layers of interpretation, but at the end of the day you need to put sort of on 3 panels a few sort of sketches and a few drawings that say that's what it is about. And I remember that you had that as a 5th year, and quite a few pieces of work that you showed had exactly a sort of quick sketch, and you think, got it, I understood what the project is about, which is very difficult to achieve. And in particular in a school where sort of the richness of language and the exuberance of texture and an amount of stuff that is being produced often lets people not sort of understand what the key drawings are. But I think you always have been incredibly crisp on that. So there's no doubt that that's what the project is focusing on. And I think these are virtues that for sure at some point through the competitions will give you more of first prizes, because people will understand them. And it was definitely the experience I had at that time, that the team understood the mood, which was one of the most important things, and that's why it was sort of kept them going. There are not the next row of selection, and again there it was, the project. Next selection, there it was again. And it went because there were these sort of key images that made people have a sort of idea of what they could dream of this thing being about. And I think that's something that is definitely coming across. When it then gets to the reality, I would say that's a funny other turn, which is, do you need that much crispiness when you build? Is the perfection of the rendering and the communication a key tool when you build? And I think that's sort of probably something for a conversation or something that has to do with language and other aspects, because it's not the same story. Obviously it's part of the same profession, but one is you're communicating an idea of something that you might be doing. The other thing is when you are actually being commissioned to do it, to build it. And it's a different...
Absolutely.
So it sort of shifts inverts almost the process in a funny way.
Yeah.
And the more you were showing, the more I was thinking about, it's interesting how a strategy goes in one direction, but when the same strategy is used for the building, the result is a slightly different one, interestingly.
It's very, very astute, and it's something that I thought about as well, as a kind of self-critique of a lot of the stuff that we do.
Thank you so much. It was great.
Thank you.